Hey guys, let's talk some hard truth about being a junkie, a Christian junkie. Now, I don't know if you know this term or not, but I think even today, Christians can fall into the trap of being junkies. You know, if you think about a junkie as someone who's maybe a drug addict is what you think, is they're addicted to drugs, which is certainly a bad thing. But Christian junkies can be addicted to things as well that we might not think of as bad, but could actually be used to keep you from making an impact on your world because all you're doing is focusing on those things. So there are three types of Christian junkies today. And here's the first one, the theology junkie. Now here's what a theology junkie is. It's a Christian who loves theology so much that he or she has made his or her whole life revolve around theology. I mean, this is a person you'll find in Bible studies week after week and loves theology and loves to debate theology. But at the end of the day, they're just a theology junkie because they're not really using it in their life. They're certainly not loving people around them. It hasn't really impacted the way they live their faith. They're not mentoring anybody. They're not helping anyone pursue God. They just love to study their Bible, and so they're a theology junkie. Here's what Paul would say to that person. In 1 Corinthians 13, he said, if I had the gift of prophecy, and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could move mountains, but didn't love others, I would be nothing. See, I think Paul understood this particularly well because Paul was a theology junkie as a Pharisee. He was someone who knew the letter of the law. I mean, he really knew the letter of the law, but he had no love. He didn't know who Jesus was. He didn't reflect the heart of God to the people in his world. And this is what he's saying here. He's talking to this church in Corinth. Probably they had some theology junkies in that church. They were just a typical church. And Paul is saying, guys, don't forget, it's all about love. I don't care how much you know. I don't care how much theology you know. If you don't possess love, if you don't love God and love people, because that, after all, is what Jesus said is the most important thing in all of theology, love God and love people. If you don't love God and love people, then who cares? You've already lost. So don't be a theology junkie. Here's the second kind of junkie, a concert junkie. And this can also be a Christian conference junkie. And these kinds of junkies are those people that show up to every Christian concert and every conference that they can get into. And there's nothing wrong with conferences and there's nothing wrong with concerts, just like there's nothing wrong with theology. But here's where they become a junkie. It's when, they worship God and they love the concerts and they're just into the whole thing. But really, they're just sort of waiting for their next fix, their next concert, their next worship experience, their next conference. And they're really not sort of bringing it into their everyday life because they've become a junkie for that particular experience. This is related to a worship junkie, because a worship junkie, they love to worship. Maybe you see them raising their hands. And I knew people like this even in high school that would just go all out in their worship. But then if you saw what they did on the weekends, you're like, what was all that stuff that you were singing about to Jesus? Like, I thought you really loved Jesus, but yet maybe they're just a junkie. God himself said, I don't like that kind of worship where you draw near to me with your lips, he said, but your hearts are far from me. He was talking about those kinds of junkies. And here's the third kind of junkie, and it's a pastor junkie. Now, I'm a pastor, so I have to admit that there's something in me that loves when people love me and they come up and say, oh, I love your teaching and I love how you teach and all that. Every pastor, everybody wants to be stroked like that and wants to hear that kind of stuff. But listen, don't be a pastor junkie. A pastor junkie is someone who is more interested, more fixated on this pastor or that preacher. A lot of times pastor junkies just listen to a lot of sermons on the radio or on podcasts. And again, there's nothing wrong with pastors. We need them in the church. We need good teachers. But don't become a junkie. A junkie is someone who focuses more on the person or the personality or that particular teacher than what they're teaching or the Word of God itself or even God himself. Paul said this to the church in Corinth. He said, when one of you says, I'm a follower of Paul, and another says, I follow Apollos, aren't you acting just like people of the world? After all, who is Apollos? Who is Paul? We are only God's servants through whom you believe the good news. Each of us did the work the Lord gave us. See, here's what was happening. If you've read any on Paul and Apollos, Apollos was a Christian. He was great. In fact, the book of Acts says that Apollos was a very eloquent speaker. Now, it doesn't say that about Paul anywhere, but it says that Apollos was a very eloquent speaker. So maybe Paul wasn't as eloquent of a speaker. He probably wasn't. He was more of a grinder. But people loved their Apollos. You know, in Corinth, they loved their Apollos because he was just such a good teacher. And so what Paul was saying is, don't become a junkie. It's not about Apollos. It's not about me, Paul said. It's about Jesus. We're just doing our part. And we want to get out of the way. John the Baptist said it so well. He said, I want Jesus to become greater and I want to become less, right? And that's what every good pastor or teacher should say and understand and believe and think is, don't follow me, follow Jesus. It's not about me, it's about Jesus. So don't be a pastor junkie. You know, you can have your favorite pastors, that's fine. But don't be a junkie. Don't be just so focused on them that you're losing your focus on what it's really all about, and it's about Jesus Christ. So use the resources below to talk about these 3 types of Christian junkies and make sure you don't become one of them.